Hello, puppies and kittens. I'm entertaining for the moment some hairy, scary peeps. We're talking about Bible history. Of course, we have my good friend Lawrence, who is studying biblical history, has already learned the ancient Greek. I think a few variants of ancient Greek to add to the wealth of languages that he already knew. And then, of course, his friend Chrissy Hanson also published some books on biblical history, and we have Dr. Kipp Davis, who is a Hebrew Bible scholar and an expert, generally considered to be an expert in the Dead Sea Scrolls. All right.
Yeah.
Great to see this assemblage, and today we're talking about whether Jesus was a historic character. Anybody want to just have anything to open with?
I think it might be best first to kind of get your position on it, because I've read and so I know Chrissy has read a ton of different views on different variations of mythicism, and sometimes they can range, right? They go from like the absolute bonkers, Jesus was invented at the Council of Nicaea, and then it ranges to, on the extreme historicist side, everything is literal, even the contradictions. So
Sure.
There's a wide range, right?
So I think if I describe my position, I think it'll take maybe 3 minutes. But I posted a presentation called Mythical Man, and that it was that I accept that there was at least one, and the problem is there's too many Jesus and that like Josephus mentioned 19 of them, and arguably 20 if you talk about the unnamed character that was on the cross that he ordered to take down, who died, and that we know that elements of the Jesus story were taken from, let's say, appropriated from John the Baptist, for example. It seems quite an obvious appropriation there. I went through a neo-pagan stage in which all these other people are telling me the stories about their patron deities and everything, that 500 years before Jesus are already turning water into wine in a more dramatic way than Jesus eventually did. So I'm thinking that either Dionysus really could turn water into wine, or Jesus couldn't do it either. That was my position there. And it occurs to me the highest probability is that there was at least one, and probably more than one, who's there wouldn't be one guy upon which all of the Jesus legend comes from. There would be, if there is one guy, then not all of the legend comes from him. And we already know that, that things like the story of the adulteress, for example, was added later. So that's not part of the Jesus story. I suspect that with the other gospels that didn't make it into canon, where Jesus kills a kid or argues against having circumcisions or whatever, we have all of these other disparate stories that don't all belong. The parallel that I draw is that Jesus is similar to Vlad Tepes, Vlad Dracul, or he is similar to Robin Hood. If you went back in time in a time machine, you grab Robin Hood and then you show him the movie with Kevin Costner playing Robin Hood, for example, and Jesus, or excuse me, Robin Hood would be confused. Who the hell is this Maid Marian character? Maybe he knows about Little John. Maybe, right? You can pick any movie about King Arthur, you're going to have the same kind of thing, right? And Vlad Tepes, and all of these people are going to be upset that the things they did that for which they thought they would be remembered is completely forgotten. And that many of the things that are attributed to these characters are things these guys never did, don't even remember. So if Jesus were to come back and see The Passion of the Christ or Jesus Christ Superstar, he might not recognize that these movies were made about him.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, I'm not going to disagree with very much of that.
No, me neither.
I am thoroughly going to agree with the idea that the Jesus story is something that is accumulating portions and legend over time, and we already see that in the canonical texts. Like the Gospel of Mark is our first gospel, and there is no nativity in the Gospel of Mark. The whole of the Nativity is something that accumulates later in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, and they both give completely different nativities that are incompatible with each other, because they both want to time Jesus's birth differently and for different apologetical reasons. Like Matthew is concerned with making Jesus look like another Moses, so he turns Herod into a baby murderer who is going to go slaughter all the firstborn sons or whatever of this specific area, so that so that Jesus can't come up against him, because he fears Jesus rising up, and wants to kill him as a child. Well, then they flee to Egypt, and it's just a parallel of the flight of Moses and all that. It's also just a general trope in Greco-Roman literature, where like some king, or usually like your grandfather or your father or something like that's going to try and kill you in infancy. We have like countless examples of this happening in Greco-Roman bioe, which is also what the Gospels largely are mimicking, is that ancient Greco-Roman biographical genre. So of course, when you write in a specific genre, you accumulate mythic elements that are tropes of that genre as well. So you're going to accumulate things like Jesus healing people, and I would argue that probably part of that, the way that his like empty tomb narrative is shaped, is also probably influenced by this as well. So yeah.
Kipp, you want to go next?
Yeah. No, I don't have a lot to, well, I guess maybe looking at this in through a different lens. The other thing that that we need to pay close attention to are the similarities between the stories in terms of how we understand this literature is developing, right? Chrissy mentioned that Matthew and Luke are doing different things by adding these competing birth narratives. The other thing that they're doing is just basically wholesale copying Mark into their own new versions, their own new renditions of this story. And I think it's really important to understand what they're doing and what's going on here. I know I have a friend who's I believe he's done his MA work in the classics. He's on YouTube. His name's Camille Gregor. He's written some really good peer-reviewed articles about the New Testament and about countering Christian apologetic approaches to the New Testament. And one of the things that he has said, at least to me in passing, is he's becoming increasingly convinced that these other synoptic gospels, what we call the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they're all so similar to one another. And scholars now look at that and say, well, of course, because all Matthew and Luke are doing is just basically taking the Gospel of Mark and shifting it towards their own purposes, right? I know Camille has said that he is starting to think maybe these are even better understood as recensions and not even entirely separate gospels, right? So sorry about that. But so yeah, not even entirely separate gospels. Matthew and Luke are writing because they perceive problems with Mark, and their goal is to fix them. And in the process of doing so, they're basically repeating a lot of what's there, supplementing it, removing some things from time to time, and then expanding it with some of their own stuff. So the literary picture here is pretty complex, and this also makes it really difficult to do what scholars I guess would call historical Jesus studies, trying to find who Jesus was and what he did in the pages of the Gospels, in the pages of the New Testament, really, just on the basis of the type of literature that we have that survived and come down to us.
We also have works like the Didache, right? So that's a pretty early representation of an early Christian community, and it's not, it's not in the Bible. It's not a canonical text, but it does show some. There's this one verse, I forget which one it is, but there's a verse that shares a very strong parallel to Matthew. Like it's verbatim, basically,
Yes.
and it tells you about the way of the method of baptism, but it's supposed to be you should baptize in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But in the Didache, it's you baptize once for each of them. Instead of one baptism in the name of these three, it's you baptize once for each of those separate entities. So that tells you a lot about these developing traditions and then how they show up in the gospel narratives. And I would also like to point out that the way that myths develop around people it's a slow process. Sometimes it's specifically to combat another set of myths or another another set of values, whatever it may be, right? But a lot of the time these they are cumulative, right? So when we have a text like the Gospels, for example, yes, they are filled with mythic imagery, but we have to remember that that mythic imagery is not necessarily like whole cloth made up, but they're building off of their own traditions in their own communities. So you have many different strands of traditions uh about Jesus and his teachings kind of lying behind all of the text. So although there is certainly dependence, absolutely, especially on Mark, that
There's a
doesn't
socio-political context also, and
there is, yeah.
socio-religious context behind them
Yeah,
as well.
yeah, and since they're all coming from these slightly different perspectives, we can kind of it gets very difficult, right? Anyone who goes into it will come out with slightly different views on the historical Jesus if they're studying it critically. Uh, and then in many cases, it's like, can we even really tell anything about Jesus other than that he was there and that he died? uh, that's that's I guess I kind of forgot where I was totally going with that.
If
But
I'm still going to describe my perspective on this, I would also note that I've been in, for various reasons, I've been in the news a couple of times back in the 80s, and I noticed that whenever a reporter is reporting on a story, they get important details wrong, or they just put in embellishments, right?
Yep.
And I remember reading Orwell was complaining that in his time he would be reading about events that never happened, that everything was highly biased in all the news that he read, to the point that that they're reporting battles that never occurred, or not reporting things that had occurred. And of course, people come back from the Vietnam War with similar complaints about how the news media is colorizing everything. And I'm thinking that the way that reporters either fudged the details or simply made up stuff in the cases of the stories that I was involved in. And these are both matters where there would be no reason to embellish anything. There's no agenda. You're just you're just reporting a thing that happened, right? Why are we making all this stuff up? But then if you look at the scriptures, now we have something that is absurdly biased, and so it would be highly questionable. And
Yes.
so the very people who question the news that they're reading in the newspaper somehow don't question the most dubious accounts of anything, the things you should question most, which would be the scriptures.
That on its own is pretty remarkable. Yeah.
Yeah, and Yeah, and there's certainly just so much of that throughout, especially like the Gospels. Like we go through the Gospels, and you can find a lot of instances of how those biases play a part in shaping the narratives as they go. So, for instance, the Gospel of Mark doesn't have one of the very traditional criteria that have been used in Jesus studies is like the criterion of embarrassment. And it's a favorite of apologists. Apologists love to abuse it to no end. And one of the ways that it's frequently used is to argue, like, Jesus was historically baptized, because Christians wouldn't make that up because it seems to imply some kind of subordination to John the Baptist. And
I have a very different opinion about that, if I may. Can I interject? I don't mean to
Oh, yeah.
interrupt.
Sure.
But thank you. So I read this story, an old Persian story that was it was a Muslim story about a Persian immigrant who's looking for the truth of God. So he's coming out of Zoroastrianism, and he's headed to Medina or Mecca, I forget which, and he goes and meets Jesus. Now this is centuries after Jesus was supposed to have died, according to the Bible, but according to Islam, Jesus never died. He was never crucified. So this Persian Zoroastrian meets Jesus. And Jesus comes out of his house every day. He's hundreds of years old, and he has a line of people who are sick. And Jesus goes out and he heals them all because Jesus is a faith healer. And this Persian asks him, for the truth of God or whatever. And Jesus says, "Well, I am not the final prophet. You'll have to talk to Muhammad." And so here we have Christianity, Jesus himself being appropriated by Islam. And what I see is the story of John the Baptist does exactly the same thing. Here, John the Baptist has a cult. We can verify this cult existed. And then he does this strange thing where he baptizes Jesus and then tells all of his followers, "You should follow this guy, not me, but this guy. You should follow this guy from now on." And that seems highly dubious.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and and
Yeah.
I was going to make that exact point. Actually, is that appropriation that's going on? The earliest gospel, Mark, doesn't actually have that. It says that Jesus is baptized for the remission of sins, and it leaves it at that. Like, the outright implication of Mark is that Jesus was sinful prior to Mark never says Jesus is a sinless person, and I actually do challenge currently scholars that think that was just a taken for granted thing necessarily. But then Matthew and Luke do think Jesus is sinless, and so they have to come up with new ways of actually getting around that, and actually finding other ways of subordinating John to Jesus in ways that actually are going to work. So then you have, like the John prophesying there's one who's going to come who is even greater than I, and stuff like that, and making it clear that he's just the forerunner to the main event coming down the line.
And Joseph
So
Smith
I
famously
think
did the
there's
same thing. He wrote of himself in his own works where he prophesied his own coming.
Yeah.
how convenient for him. There's even another layer even before this, where I suspect most scholars would agree that this does probably reflect something that could be traced or reasonably be supposed for the life of an historical Jesus, because the idea of baptism for the remission of sins is itself probably a misunderstanding of Jewish ritual practice that was rather prevalent. Certainly, we know of it quite readily from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and this is something that that was of supreme concern for this group that we have identified as the Yachad Essenes, this group of elite Jewish ascetics living out in the wilderness and awaiting the last days. They were also absolutely obsessed with the idea of ritual purification. So this is probably, a reflection of the world out of which Jesus came, from perhaps a sect which practiced a form of ritual, an apocalyptic sect which practiced a form of ritual purification. Sure sounds like what they were doing in Qumran. Why wouldn't they have been doing this in a variety of other places throughout Roman Palestine as well?
Yeah. And then eventually it just becomes, it starts accumulating other features, and it has to start changing necessarily as their theology also is developing, because then it just becomes increasingly inconvenient to the point you get to the Gospel of Matthew, who just decides it didn't happen and omits it entirely.
I hope my shirt is
It's a cool
appropriate.
shirt. It's a,
Oh, yeah.
it's a cool shirt.
I did
So,
ask
mine
a
is
Christian apologist.
mine is
about
Oscar
that.
the Grouch. So
Mine is just black.
Mine is I mean, you might recognize this as an album cover, like the
Oh,
the
yeah.
Is that
Guns N'
Guns N'
Roses album.
Roses?
Yeah, but this is
Yeah.
actually the Inner Circle,
Yeah.
which was a faction in AEW. So on that, like I want to parallel this with something that came up a little bit later in time. So there was, I'm sure you guys have read the Acts or heard of the Acts of Paul and Thecla. Now,
Oh yeah, I love that book.
It's awesome. I love the Acts of Paul and Thecla. So that would be like a base text, right? But the thing is, you still have a cult of Thecla popping up, and it's in different places. And in each of those places, they start developing their own traditions and their own myths about Thecla. So whether or not there was a real Thecla, I don't know. There's that one's still debated, but usually it's taken that Thecla was not a real person. But the thing about these myths is that even though they have this sacred text, they still added onto it for their own purposes. So like Thecla herself in some of these cults would show up to her followers and like have conversations with them, and in bed specifically. So like there are different traditions that pop up hundreds of years like within the first couple hundred years, that you have this base text, but then even though that's considered like the base text, you still have traditions about Thecla adding on to it, being added onto.
Yeah.
So
Without this notion of a personal God, I want to address that too, because I mean, people tell me that they have a personal relationship with Jesus. George Harrison, used to be a Beatles fan when I was a kid. George Harrison was talking, and John Lennon both were talking about how when you chant the mantras and meditate and everything, that Lord Krishna would appear with you, that you can see him, hear him talking with you, that you're having conversations with this real guy in the room. You just got to believe that he's there and you can see it. And I've also seen, and he said that this was proof of of God belief, that he said it was foolish to believe anything on faith, but if you chant the mantras, whoop, whoop, there's Krishna, you can see him, there's proof that he's there. And I don't see Christians ever seeing that Jesus just appears physically manifest to talk to them in real time like that, like Krishna does. And then I know another guy lives a couple miles from me that or not even a mile from me, who was always a bit of a weird cat fancier. So it was no surprise when Bast appeared in his house. Physically manifest, visible, audible, tangible, gave him a hug, and bade him to become her disciple. And I think that pulling off, a topless lady with a cat's head, it would be a difficult thing to pull off. So to something like that is, hey, worship me. Okay, fine, as you do. Right? So the whole personal relationship with God thing doesn't impress me at all. The thing you mentioned about embarrassment before, however, we're talking about a guy, basically a faith healer, who's doing the same scam that faith healers are still doing today. He's a self-described exorcist because he doesn't know the causes of the maladies that he's pretending to heal. He thinks diseases are caused by demons. So not the guy to take medical advice from.
I think a lot of people in the ancient world, believe that illnesses were caused by demons. I know that there was, and I know, Kipp might know what I'm talking about here. I know there was a text in the Dead Sea Scrolls that specifically like outlined different afflictions and then the associated demons. So like there was like a chest pains demon, for example.
Yep, there's also like the Maklu tablets as well, which also will describe like different demons and the maladies that they cause, and different issues that arise from them as well. Like this was it's a very widespread belief, and for the time it also makes sense if when that's your your view of the world, and both your theology and your cosmology are hinged on this idea of a very permeated spiritual world, and you don't have access to advanced electron microscopes, and you can actually like see bacteria. Your next best explanation is going to be what you know.
Yeah. And that's when you start putting demons into pigs and running them off of cliffs.
Yeah, pretty fun scene.
Yeah.
Well, and that's also a really fun one as like political propaganda as well, because the name of the demon is Legion. It is specifically poking at it is a probably fictional story that comes about to poke fun at the Roman Empire, which the Gospel of Mark does throughout the Gospel.
So there's a lot of these stories that were never intended to be taken as literally true. They're all like symbolic political cartoons.
I think there's a lot of that, yeah. And what scholars tend to do when they read the Gospels is, I mean, a couple of things. We see these texts primarily as theological texts, right? Promoting an ideal or a form of the Christian religion through the lens of the life of Jesus. But then also what scholars will tend to do is try and peek behind the curtain as best as they can to see, well, how much of this stuff can we make sense within the world of Jesus? And maybe it's useful to talk a little bit about like the landscape of the first century Palestine, first century Jerusalem, early Judaism, and where exactly Jesus fits into this, right? I think it was in the early 20th century. One of the greatest biblical scholars was also a remarkable medical doctor, and I believe a foreign diplomat, Albert Schweitzer. He wrote he broached this question early on, and it's still sort of the standard model through which we see the historical Jesus against this backdrop of apocalyptic Judaism. So apocalyptic Judaism is it's essentially a worldview. It's a worldview with this sharp dichotomy between forces of good and forces of evil, with this cosmological perspective of things as just being completely reprobate and degenerating and progressively getting worse and worse. And it's overridden by this conflict between forces of good and evil, but over which God can see, the end from the beginning and the beginning from the end. He sees this all mapped out, and he's got it all planned, so that in the end, he's going to come in and intervene and restore order and end the chaos and defeat evil. And these sorts of apocalyptic ideas tend to propagate in times when groups are heavily oppressed or enduring great persecution. So this started to become quite popular in early Judaism. It starts to come out a little bit following the Babylonian exile, but then just took on a life of its own, really, in the 2nd century BCE when Antiochus IV Epiphanes desecrated the Jerusalem temple and sparked a rebellion, which ultimately resulted in the establishment of maybe the first independent state of Judea, the first independent state of Israel, maybe even ever. It's tough to say, but it was the result of these fierce feelings of persecution, which were then also carried through following the invasion of Pompeii in I believe it's the year 60 BCE. He came in and basically wiped out the Hasmoneans, and the region became subject to the Romans. And these fierce feelings of persecution escalated as a result of that, and people had this enduring sense that things are getting worse and worse and worse. The Romans are just they are putting us under their thumb, and it's going to take an act of God to come down and defeat our enemies in Rome. So these are the sorts of feelings that are quite common within within the time of Jesus, within his world. And when you look at the writings of the New Testament, and then you compare them also to some of the message that's being forwarded by the Apostle Paul, which are the earliest writings of the New Testament that we have, and you start to compare that to other forms of apocalyptic literature being written in early Judaism, you start to see these common threads. So scholars will look at texts in the Gospel of Mark, the very first proclamation of Jesus, the heart of his message, called a gospel. I think it's I think it's a poor term to use just because of how weighted it is. But the message of Jesus at its earliest stage seems to be just this: repent and get ready, because the kingdom of God is coming. And this is a very traditionally apocalyptic Jewish message. This is by and large exactly what the writers and the collectors of the Dead Sea Scrolls were saying. As far as Paul was concerned, it was imminent because the life and death and resurrection of Jesus signaled that this was all right on the brink, like it's about to happen at any moment. But
Then I need a
this
moment of
is
clarification. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
sure. No, I was just going to say this is kind of the backdrop, and this is how scholars tend to read a lot of the stuff in the Gospels in an effort to find those bits and pieces of the so-called historical Jesus, this apocalyptic prophet of the new millennium, living in the first half of the first century.
So on the note of the historical Jesus, as pertaining to the historicity, you mentioned 60 CE, which if that might have been
that was BCE. Sorry,
you
with the Roman
mentioned
invasion,
Pompeii.
Yeah.
Okay,
that's 60
The
BC.
Roman general Pompey.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, gotcha. So I was
Sorry about
confusing
that. That was
well.
you're confusing that
brought
with
me to
the temple stuff.
yeah. Well, that
later.
reminded me of Pliny the Younger, I think it was, or Seneca. I can't remember which one wrote it, but a beautifully detailed account of the eruption of Pompeii. And then when you gave that data,
Sure.
I was thinking, was that is it 79 CE? Because I'm getting it confused with when the Boudica, the queen of the Iceni, momentarily drove the Romans out of Londinium, roughly the same time, not long after the eruption of Pompeii, if I remember correctly. But both of those are detailed historical accounts, and there's things going on in the Jesus story that ought to be detailed and that are not. And so that brings big questions with a lot of the legend of Jesus. I don't have a problem with a first century faith healer and cult leader, some idiot who doesn't know what he's talking about, but any of the miracles that are attributed to him. There should have been some kind of, when the undead saints doing the Thriller in downtown Judea, somebody should have mentioned that.
Yeah, well, and this is part of what comes up, especially in like Greco-Roman bio-y, but also in Jewish literature as well. Like, it's very, very common for them to ascribe miracles to people who were like really noteworthy in those in their tradition. So, like, in Jewish tradition, you're going to find things like Choni the circle drawer, and he has the miraculous ability to call forth rain from God, and it's a really interesting story. And you also get like people who claim that they would have the ability to like part the Jordan. There was actually an entire episode with that Josephus describes, and the Romans had to put it down lest it actually happen and then inspire revolt. And then I would say even more pertinently, which from our earliest gospel, Mark, what you find very clearly, and this is like evident from just like the very beginning, is that Mark is very concerned in providing alternative encounter to the imperial cult. And you even get that with like the terms like gospel. Evangelion is a term that originates in the imperial cult, and it is used specifically to announce the good news of emperors and stuff like that. So you get announcements about the good news of the son of God, Augustus, and stuff like that, like in the Priene calendar. But even more importantly is like the miracle aspects. Those are things that just accumulate all the time for like noteworthy persons, regardless of any actual eyewitness testimony or anything like that. So like if you read the biographies of the 12 Caesars by Suetonius, and these are written at the beginning or first decades of the 2nd century, they are littered with miraculous claims. Like half of these Caesars are all born from some wild stuff. Like one birth involves a snake, one of the or conception. Others have like divine prophecies that foretell their births. There's miracles they performed. Augustus was known to calm the sea. Alexander the Great, the sea bowed before him as well. This is this one is in a biography of Callisthenes. Callisthenes, who was he was an actual eyewitness. He knew Alexander. He was Alexander's biographer, and he recorded in his biography that Alexander came to the sea and it bowed before him. It receded before him because of his majesty and his greatness. And you find all sorts of just these amazing stories being told, even by people who probably know they didn't happen. And the reason that this is just because this is the standard of just how you write ancient biographies. Is like when you write an ancient biography, your number one job is to do one of two things: either make this person out to be the greatest person ever, or make this person out to be Domitian, the worst person ever.
That was one of the arguments that I made about the character of Satan in the Bible. I'm like, what's the worst thing this guy ever does, apart from the 10 people he killed at God's command? The worst thing Satan ever does in the Bible is try to reason with people. He tries to reason Jesus. He tries to reason against faith. But anyway, that's a different topic. I had another question for clarification. Jesus says, you talk about how Jesus' return was supposed to be imminent. So what I read is that Jesus tells a handful of people, his disciples, and at least one or two other people, that very soon, this generation, some of you here standing will still be alive when you see, the Son of Man return in the clouds at the right hand of power. And it's the fact that he says that some of you will not even taste of death. When you get the excuse that, well, they died in the spirit, or they died in the flesh, but not in the spirit. How is it some then? We're waiting 2,000 years. They died. They tasted of death. That's what death tastes like when the flesh dies. So
yeah,
isn't Jesus like 1,900 years late?
Yeah, well, essentially, and that's one of the big problems is like the early Gospels very clearly envision that Jesus is going to be coming back very soon. It is imminent. Like Jesus says, some of you are not going to taste death. Paul thinks that the end times are being revealed right then and there. Like when he writes that the wrath of God is being revealed upon them this instant, and this is when he's referencing the Jews that killed Jesus in 1 Thessalonians 2:14-16. He also says another thing in, I think, like Romans chapter 3. He's very clearly just making it evident. Like, he thinks that the wrath of God is coming right now. He thinks the end times is happening. We're in it. So yeah, no, that's basically one of the things that makes us suspect he was an apocalyptic prophet, is the prophecies are wrong.
And it's especially helpful then too for recontextualizing some of the things that are attributed to Jesus. Yeah, helps us to give us a clearer understanding of what he's getting at, right? In the Sermon on the Mount, when he talks about not worrying about what you're going to wear or what you're going to eat or holding down a job or any of these things, it's because the kingdom of God is imminent. I just did some writing about this recently. The passage in I'm gonna get it wrong, but in the book of Matthew, where not Matthew 19, sorry, that's it. Where Jesus talks about supposedly about marriage. If you read through that entire exchange carefully that Jesus has with the rabbis about marriage and the kingdom of God, and then the follow-up conversation that he has with his own followers, you discover that this makes the best sense in the respect that the expectation is that we're not going to be here for very long, that there's no reason to be planning for the future because God's coming imminently. The kingdom of God is on the horizon. So don't worry about these fruitless worldly pursuits, because these are the sorts of things that are going to be meaningless in the kingdom of God. And of course, this is all stuff that then gets recontextualized and reinterpreted and reunderstood from later perspectives and turned into all sorts of really awful ideas and doctrines. I'll just finish on this. One of the things that I think is exceptionally dangerous is what happens when an apocalyptic message, which is born out of persecution, gets into the hands of those who are in power. Because all of a sudden, this is not just a revenge fantasy anymore. All of a sudden, this becomes, a push towards something that looks more like Christian dominionism or Christian nationalism.
I have to share a short anecdote. One of my earliest fleeting memories is I'm in a house with like way too many children. We're running up and down the stairway with all these other kids. And I remember telling my mother about this. Where were we? And she reminded me that there was this. I don't know if they were Jehovah's Witnesses or what they were, but they were some extreme religious couple who refused to mow their lawn, who refused to fix the holes in the wall because Jesus is coming back any minute now. And for my age, for this to be one of my earliest memories, that would have been 1965. They're not mowing the lawn because Jesus is coming back in 65. Fast forward to 75.
Yeah.
A similar thing. This cute girl has me walk her home from middle school, and the real thing is that she's bait. She's been coerced by her family to bring young boys into the house so that they can proselytize to them. So that I meet the dad and everything, and everything is all pleasant for about a minute, before everybody in the house is jumping up and down or writhing around on the floor and speaking in tongues and yelling and shouting about how any minute now the world will be engulfed in flames. They'll disappear, and I will be in a lake of fire. And they're shrieking this at me, and I'm crying because I'm in a madhouse.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and Jesus still ain't been back. And how many times has the end of the world come and gone so far in my life that I've lived through?
Yeah, well, and it's still a thing in Jehovah's Witnesses, especially particularly like they don't pursue elite jobs, they don't pursue college, and they don't pursue things like that, or they actively discourage it because the end times is going to be coming, and you don't need to be putting away and amassing massive amount of wealth or anything like that. It's unimportant. So they often are taking like lower level jobs and spending a lot of their time proselytizing. And you see that with a bunch of other groups. My family, for instance, we came from a group, they're Radical Holiness Evangelists. That was a movement that started in the mid 1800s. And you'll know it best today for like the Salvation Army. That's a related movement. But mine was called our family's part was called the Pentecost Bands, and they were world evangelists, and they believed that the end times were imminent. And not only that, you can you read like I have my great grandmother's diaries still. And you go read those diaries, and she fully believes God is currently at war in the heavens with Satan fighting him. And that there is Earth is a battlefield of Satan currently right now. Satan is constantly at work. It is this huge eschatological war. And then you see how this belief, this very eschatological belief, shifts dramatically at the turn of from around 1919 and 1920s into the 1920s, when the Soviet Union starts popping up on everyone's radar. And then all of a sudden, all of this becomes exceptionally political, pro-conservatism, because the Soviet Union becomes the enemy manifest. And now that kind of that kind of war fantasy that's previously just primarily in a spiritual realm is now being manifest on Earth to organize and politicize religion into essentially a dangerous conservative voting bloc. And that's what we're seeing right now. Trump has become an eschatological Christ figure to mainstream evangelicals.
Which just stuns me. I mean, nothing says godly quite like fornication and adultery. When your wife is nursing your newborn son. A couple things I need to clarify since we're talking about historicity of Jesus. One of them is that Christians will often claim that just because somebody notices that, well, they'll say that that Josephus and the other names I forget evade me at the moment.
There's Tacitus,
Suetonius. Tacitus was yeah. So they were aware of Christians, but that doesn't give us a date for the Christ figure. And then when you bring up when they notice little things like Jesus ben Ananias or Jesus of Damnius, they'll say, well, that's their guy. Even when we know that no, these are different Jesus neither one of these are the one that you're looking for. But they'll claim them.
Yeah, I would largely dismiss the use of the extra biblical sources. I have a paper on Tacitus. I think that Tacitus is probably deriving his information from his friend Pliny the Younger, who was just interrogating Christians. Kipp and I will probably disagree where we land on Josephus. I think both of the mentions of, like the Christian Jesus in Josephus are interpolations.
I think that's pretty much universal, isn't it?
No, it isn't. I'm definitely in a minority, especially on the James passage.
Yeah, so the two passages from Josephus is the famous Testimonium Flavium from Book 18, which scholars are unanimous that it has been tampered with by later Christian scribes, and are split on whether this is, just partially authentic or completely inserted. I personally still tend to gravitate toward the idea that there was something there, that mentioned the Jesus of Nazareth. Of course, missing are the clear Christian interpolations about him being the Messiah, and about being a miracle worker who rose from the dead.
Things that no
None of
Jew
that
would have
is
said anyway.
things that no Jew would have said, but there's certainly a strong case to be made that Josephus, that much of what is said there is something that Josephus was typical of saying. I'm not, I don't know exactly where I fall on that, although I do continue to find it relatively compelling that there was probably something there. The other one is in book 20, and this is in a section where Josephus is telling the story of basically the corruption of the priesthood leading up to the start of the Jewish War, and at one point he mentions this figure. Um, uh, uh, it's Ben Ananias, I believe, right? Is the priest who's mentioned, who's uh a young um um uh candidate, a young appointee to the high priesthood in Jerusalem. He's politically ambitious, and takes advantage of a situation when I believe it's either there's no governor in the area at the time, and convicts a bunch of people that he's got problems with on trumped up charges. The people are upset by this, and they write to the emperor, and the emperor deposes him and sets in place another priest, whose name is Jesus ben Damnius. Now, in introducing this passage, Josephus says that this figure Ananias, um, he he rounds up a bunch of leading Jewish men, including this James, the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ
Anointed?
or Messiah, anointed one, right? Um, Now it has been suggested that this is either, I know Chrissy believes that this is an entire interpolation. Richard Carrier has suggested that the place where he's the so-called Christ has been interpolated, and that this is actually a clever revenge story about how um James's brother, Jesus ben Damnius, gets the priesthood because of this, this terrible, um, um, unjust action of Ben Ananias by killing his brother, executing him on these false charges. The wide scholarly consensus on this passage beyond that is that this is an authentic passage to Josephus, and it is just that. It is the story of a high priest who overstepped, and James, the brother of Jesus, the so-called Messiah, um, and of course Josephus is saying this somewhat tongue in cheek, right? This is what he was called. This is also the way he tended to introduce figures into his narrative, who had very popular, frequently occurring names. You mentioned that there's 18 to 20 Jesus is in Josephus, And for this reason, the first time he mentions them, he always, provides what we call a patronym, an identifier to distinguish this figure from all these other ones that I've mentioned before, right? So this is how he does it with this particular James. James is the brother of Jesus, the so-called Messiah, that guy who got himself executed by the Romans. So this is the most scholars tend to think this is all this is a story about the high priest who overstepped. And the mention of James is kind of interesting in that it's just it's just kind of
it's
something
mostly
that's thrown out
incidental.
there.
Yeah.
It's incidental. That's the word. It's very incidental, which suggests that there was a James. He was the brother of this well-known figure, Jesus, who was promoted as a Messiah, as a Christ. And Josephus has talked about other, messianic figures throughout his work. So this is just another one, right? So historians tend to find something like that reasonably compelling, insofar as to locate at least the movement of Christianity and its attachment to these figures, James and to Jesus, as reasonably historical. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm sure Chrissy has more to say.
Yeah,
I mean, my ultimate conclusion is whether or not they're authentic is mostly immaterial for us in establishing that Jesus existed, just from the standpoint that where Josephus does not mention any of this in his earliest work, The Jewish War. James is noticeably absent when he's talking about the absolute corruption of Ananias. And so the issue comes up that this is coming up much later, and it's potentially like some new added information he's gathered while at Rome. On what basis he's gathered this is unknown. It could be that this was information now floating around in the post-Christian environment, and it might stem from them. It might stem from some Jewish source he had at hand. He was part of the priesthood, and his father was, part of the aristocracy. So he may have even been present for the event and just didn't feel a need to mention it in the Jewish War for whatever reason. We don't know the provenance of the information. So it's at best like corroborative of what we have. For me, where it comes down to the best evidence for the historical Jesus is always going to come into Paul's epistles. And that's just because they are, 15 to 20 years after the events, really close by. And then not 20 years after his letters. Then we also have the Gospels popping up. Their relation to the epistles is pretty debated. I would argue that they probably know the epistles, but they also provide like some other corroborating evidence. Like when it comes to James, the brother of Jesus, this is one of the best attested things about Jesus. Probably, I would say, arguably the best attested piece of evidence for Jesus's life is that he had siblings, and that Paul knew one of those siblings.
Originally, I didn't want to go over an hour with this, but Chrissy brought up something that needs to be discussed. Yeah, I mean, so my problem with Paul is the way that he describes fact is literally whatever he dreamt up. And that's an issue for me when he's telling people not to question what they dream, when they're supposed to literally interpret this as if it really happened.
So this
I think this is deriving from Galatians 1:12, where he says that his gospel has been received not from the teaching or passing down of any man, but from revelation through Jesus Christ alone. That one is a little bit abused because he's very specifically talking about his evangelion, his good news, which is not necessarily talking about like the facts that he derives about Jesus's life as much as specifically the teachings that Jesus gives him to give to the Gentiles, and that's how he uses that terminology in Galatians. And the reason he argues it specifically in that framework is he's using that as a way to basically tell the Galatians, this is directly from Jesus that I have received personally. This does not come from the authority of men, but comes from the authority I have that has been directly received through Christ. And that then informs the authority behind when he's like, this is how Gentiles are brought into the faith, and the exceptions that they exist to under the law and everything like that, which is like the primary focus here. Elsewhere, he actually just says that he outright does receive information from people, like in 1 Corinthians 15, when he's talking about the creedal tradition that he receives. That term that he specifically writes that he says received from the Lord, and the word that's being used there is a rendering out of Hebrew into Greek. And it usually refers to the fountainhead of a tradition that's being passed on. So he's basically just saying, this is a tradition that's being passed down the line that I have now finally received. And he then appends his name to like the list of people who have seen Jesus rise again and stuff like that. So it's not saying that he's not saying that all facts about Jesus and stuff derive from Revelation. He's saying that his specific mission and his specific message about the salvation and the eschatology and the law are deriving from Jesus.
I have one last
Lawrence
thing that I
was
want to
gonna
bring
say
up.
something.
Go ahead.
I mean, I was gonna kind of mention the importance of the brother portion, right? It's like because this is I know Kipp and Chrissy have both talked about this a lot in recent months, but it is quite obvious that from the text itself and how he is describing other and how he describes other Christians, right? Like he doesn't describe other Christians as brothers of the Lord. So that's only him. That's only this James, right? And the way that the phrase is used in other Greek literature is always to describe an actual brother. So yeah, it's not even debatable, really.
Lawrence and I actually Lawrence helps me actually with the. Sorry, Kipp, you go.
I was just gonna say before Aaron moves on to another point here. I just wanted to point out how badly abused this particular passage in Galatians chapter 1 is abused by so many people on all sides of this conversation, where whatever it is that that Paul and whatever it is that Paul is first at pains to communicate to his audience in Galatia, and then also, and secondly, what happened in this visit that he had to the church authority, basically in Jerusalem, is abused so badly by so many sides. You know, I heard recently, Christian apologist Gary Habermas, who's somehow managed to write 5,000 pages about the resurrection of Jesus. Somehow, I don't know, but he speculates in an interview that we in this meeting, and he's even talked about this as the best evidence for the resurrection. This meeting that Paul has with the leaders of the church in Jerusalem, because what would have been the very first thing that he asked them? Well, it's obvious. The first thing Paul would have asked the James and the leaders in Jerusalem is, well, when Jesus appeared to you, what did he look like? Oh, yeah? Well, that's exactly what he looked like to me. So this is how we know that Jesus rose from the dead. Importantly, it's really, really important to point out here that none of that is in the text. None of it at all. In the same sense that this idea that when Paul talks about the evangelion, his good news and his message being delivered to the Gentiles, is not the entire contents of what appears in the Gospels. This is just Paul's part of the message for the Gentiles. So it's very easy to overread a text like this in both directions, right?
So you're telling me that Jesus did not bear a striking resemblance to Leonardo da Vinci's intimate friend, one of the Borgias, or that Jesus did
No,
not have white
that's just
hair like
totally
wool.
I was gonna say I didn't say that.
That's totally fact. That he I saw Jesus just the other day. Looked exactly the same.
Can you explain that
But
Jesus has white hair like wool? I forget where that is in the
in
Bible.
terms of, so there's a there's a couple of things going on here, right? Like this is from the book of Revelation, which is, this is an apocalyptic vision. This is a very specialized piece of literature that's comparable to other apocalyptic visions that we know of elsewhere in the Bible, as well as other parts of Jewish literature, such as the book of Daniel, or the book of Enoch,
Daniel
or
would
the
be
book of
most relevant
Jubilees,
here.
or you see some of this in the Aramaic Levi document. And what the book of Revelation is doing is spending an awful lot of time recontextualizing what's in the book of Daniel. And what you have in the book of Daniel is a description of the two figures, the Son of Man, who is a celestial being, in the presence also of the Ancient of Days, who is thought to be the high god. And without getting into it too deeply, Daniel is also drawing from a lot of Canaanite mythological language and text, as a means to promote his ideas about who God is, and what's going to happen at the end of the world. So this is just the recycling of traditions over time down the line, over the course of centuries. And now the author of the book of Revelation is taking what was originally these Canaanite religious ideas, then reconstructed through the book of Daniel and applied to Yahweh. Now, again, just rewriting and recontextualizing this and putting Jesus in that position as the Son of Man and the Ancient of Days.
Yeah, and by the time that we get to Revelation, the Canaanite connotation has just been entirely lost. They don't care
Totally
about
gone
that
by
anymore.
that
It doesn't
time, yeah.
mean anything.
Yeah.
They're not even thinking about it.
Yeah. So it just ends up being the case that over time, eventually, just through a lot of series of rewriting and recontextualization, Jesus now is just appearing in a vision with woolly white hair. But yeah, with like back to Paul, the one thing I did want to mention is also like when it comes to specifically the discussion of Jesus's brother, he mentions that in Galatians 1:19, and it has absolutely nothing to do with his gospel or like his revelation.
Yeah.
It's a completely separate side tangent that he's just writing about his own personal journey of conversion and meeting the apostles, basically leading up to his then discussion in chapter 2 about having met the apostles and gone over his gospel message with them. So the meeting of James is actually completely incidental and is just part of like his personal life journey and not part of his revelatory experience either. And so he comes here and he mentions that I mentioned Cephas, that is probably Peter. And I didn't see any of the other apostles except for James, the brother of the Lord. And this is where a lot of debate comes up, is like, what does brother of the Lord mean? Lord, Carrier and others in the mythicist circles want to argue, that it means that he's like just like a baptized Christian. He's part of just like the accepted Christian or proto-Christian order at this point. The problem being that it's never used in that sense anywhere else in Paul's letters. He does refer to them as brothers, just plain, or he'll refer to them as like brothers in Christ, but brothers of the Lord is a reserved term, and it also doesn't make sense in this case. And there's multiple reasons why, but like, firstly, like grammatically, the construction. Lorence helped me. I just wrote a paper, and it's getting published with the journal Bibliotheca Sacra, hopefully this year. And in it, I go into detail. I look up every single instance of the Greek construction of ton adelphon to, and then like a name or title after that. And in every single instance, it always indicates a physical, biological sibling, without fail.
Oh,
Paul would be the only exception in history where it does not mean that. At least from like the first, like from the 2nd century BC to like the 3rd century CE, he would be the only one that that does not have that meaning. It's in terms of like probability, astronomically against the idea that this is just fraternal language. And then on top of it, it doesn't help us because there are 2 Jameses mentioned in Galatians, and people like Carrier want to also argue that brother of the Lord is a term that distinguishes people from the apostles. So James mentioned in Galatians 1:19 is not the same as James mentioned in Galatians 2. But if brothers of the Lord is just a term for a general Christian, that means all apostles are actually brothers of the Lord. So it doesn't meaningfully distinguish the two.
Okay, nor any of the others by whatever name. They would all be.
Exactly.
Yeah. They also had another...
It's basically just saying, I met James the Christian. Okay, which one?
The thing about what you're saying about like distinguishing these Jameses, right? There is like discussion to be had about like whether or not they're the same James, but the thing is they already had another term to like distinguish other apostles. I think the actual term is super apostle. I think that's the actual term that's been used. Yeah, they have other ways of designating things. They don't need they just didn't use brother of the Lord for it.
Yeah.
I've got 2 other things.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so just to sum up there, like just in terms of like the grammar and just the practicality, it has to refer to a brother of Jesus physically, because if it didn't, it doesn't make sense like at all.
There are some people that are going to ask about the Damascus moment, and all I can say to that, in my suspicion, is that something, I don't know, he saw a sound or he heard a sound that none of the other people around him heard, or he saw a light that none of the other people saw. I think there's some contradiction there, doesn't it? Say there both?
Yeah.
So, I mean, did he have a stroke? Was there a lightning strike, and other people just took it as a strike of lightning and nothing else? I don't know. It doesn't really matter. I don't think it's that important, because I
and it comes in the book of Acts, and I would just say if Acts says it, don't think it happened.
Most likely, yes.
I argue that Acts has most in common with like ancient Greek novels. It's primarily fictional. And I think it also probably has a high degree of like mimetic properties. So I'm currently working with a few other scholars like Mark Bilby and Marcus Vincent and others. And one thing that we're arguing is that it's probably influenced by things like the Bacchae, and other Greco-Roman tales of the time, where you're going to actually see, you actually get like these kinds of stories coming up of like being blinded by a deity and stuff like that. It is a common trope. And
Blinded
this is
by the light. I think I've heard that.
So where does
good song.
where does Paul actually talk about his vision, his visionary experience?
He never talks
'Cause he
about it
does
in his
mention-
letters.
No,
Yeah.
so it is in
Is
Acts.
that right?
In Acts, there are 3 different accounts of Paul's conversion.
Right.
They're all
Okay.
slightly
yeah,
different.
That's it. That's
But
right.
and then in Galatians, he does talk about the what he is receiving through
He was-
revelation, and then how he goes on to to go into
Right.
the city. Yeah, but then like there is like
Yeah,
an
yeah,
issue
yeah,
of
yeah.
time that it doesn't give enough time for it
Yes.
to actually be consistent with the account in Acts. So the account in Acts
Yeah.
is an expanded version of Paul's
Right.
story.
Yeah.
One
And
other
I
thing.
think people. No, I was just gonna say I think it's important for people to hear what we're saying really clearly here too. I mean, you've heard us talk quite a bit already about how unreliable as history texts like the Gospels and like Acts are. By the same token, even within Paul's letters, we look at certain things and say, well, this is reflective of a situation in which Paul appears to be, through which we can ascertain something as having actually happened. For example, Paul actually went to Jerusalem to talk to leaders in the Jerusalem church, right, in order to get some sort of vouchsafe on the message that he was delivering to the Gentiles. But the other thing that we need to recognize are those places where Paul is prone to making embellishments about himself or about what he's doing or about his opponents. Like one of the things that it's sort of an interesting dynamic at play here when it comes to Paul and like the Jerusalem church, because it's very clear that he really doesn't like them very much on the basis of his writing, which then also gives us some reason to be suspicious about whether or not he's being entirely accurate and truthful about everything he says about the people in the Jerusalem church. And also, we have reasons to raise questions about what he says about himself. So, when he talks about being a persecutor of the church, what does this mean? Does this mean that he just went around beating up Christians whenever he felt like it? Is it much different from when, modern day apologists talk about being, strongly devoted atheists and
We were radical
and
atheists that were working
right.
on cold cases, and
That's right. Like there's every good historian is going to take these sorts of self-identifying statements and pronouncements and descriptions of opponents with a huge grain of salt and think through carefully about how this factors into what we can really know was going on.
Yeah. And you can also look at just the way.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, Aaron. You go.
No, by all means, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say another instance. You could just look at the way he like introduces some of his letters. Like Galatians starts up admonishing the Galatians for receiving a false gospel. He hates anyone else that does not agree with him.
Yeah, he's an
Specifically.
ass. He's an absolute dick.
He is.
And I
Paul is
pointed this out online. Like he has a lot of hallmarks of like a cult leader. Don't listen to other people who tell you other messages. I've received this personally from the Lord. I have direct authority from God. You should listen to my authority on this. And look, I even made everyone else in the movement agree with me. Like
I think it's important to talk about like how scholars use the Bible as a source. We had a long discussion about this in the Discord. under unfortunate circumstances, but we had that discussion. So like Kipp said, it's important to take this, some of this stuff with a grain of salt, right? Like, we are not taking the biblical texts as like either true or false, because like I think Simone pointed it out, right?
Yep.
They're not. It's not just made of propositional claims. So like we need to be careful about how we use it. But historians will take whatever we can fucking get. Like the Bible, even though it is so much mythology, and even in Paul's letters, there's some mythic elements, and the Gospels are filled with mythology. We need to be able to look past it. We need to look between the lines, and we need to discern, like, how much can we actually tell? What is the basis for this? What is the grain of truth that this stuff is built on? And the model that pops out from that is that there was a historical Jesus who was probably an apocalyptic Jewish preacher, and then later on you get this this egomaniac Paul, who starts going to multiple places and preaching this message, starts maybe converting people here and there, starting up some churches, and then eventually you have Christianity proper. So like that is the simplest model that explains the available evidence, that makes it makes the least assumptions, is the thing. So that is, so we have to be really careful about how we use these texts.
Yeah.
So what I'm getting from you is that there's a universal agreement that Jesus was invented by the Romans per Joseph Atwell.
Yes.
Yeah.
Everyone loves Joseph Atwell so much.
And he was a cipher for Titus, as we all know, because Titus was definitely the most famous individual involved in the Jewish war, and not his father.
Definitely no one else. Just Titus. Just pay attention to this beautiful arch. That's it. That's all there is.
I think one important thing to add to what Lorence was saying, and I think I consider this a crucial feature of the historicity of Jesus that we get from Paul, is that Jesus was crucified by the Romans, and this is part of understanding who he was within his own time and his own place as an apocalyptic Jewish prophet who ran afoul the Romans, and they executed him for it. One of the things
I don't know how
cross imagery is very common. I
don't know how any of you would speak to this, but I have to wonder why Islam considers that Jesus was never crucified at all.
I have no idea.
Probably in the same way that Josephus don't think he was crucified, but it's something like that. Maybe I'm not.
I wasn't even aware of that. I'm sorry to say.
There's probably multiple levels going on there, but probably one is going to be the Islam definitely had some kind of influence from more heretical groups of Christianity, probably also from like the Manichaeans as well. So like some Gnostic influence, and then also what's probably also going on is avoiding Christian resurrection claims, because those are central to like Christian claims of authority, especially by the time Islam's coming about. The assertion that Jesus was resurrected is like the ultimate sign of his divinity, if you're trying to claim that Muhammad is the last prophet, having someone that does something far more impressive, like rising from the dead on God's authority, is a little bit more challenging on that front.
I would have expected that if Jesus was crucified, then we would have the conflicting story where some heretical groups would have accepted that he died. People die, right? And so that Islam would reflect that he was crucified and died, not that he's still creeping around like Highlander 400 years later.
He's still a prophet for them.
No.
Right. So.
Yeah. It comes down to the fact that they still revere him. And so there's still a level at which they're going to do that, but there's also a level at which they're attempting to counter that claim. Gnostics got around, like different Gnostic groups got around it in different ways. So, for example, one of the teachings that we find in like Irenaeus and his Against All Heresies records a tradition, I think, from the Basilidians, and they just claimed that Jesus and Simon of Cyrene looked so alike that they switched places. And Simon of Cyrene was the person who was crucified. And this originates back in like the 2nd century. Basilides was probably a contemporary or close to a contemporary of Marcion and Valentinus. And then you also get others like the Docetics who think that Jesus appeared on earth, but because they regard mortal flesh as sinful and Jesus was sinless, he had to be a phantasm. So he only mimicked death upon the crucifixion. And you get others that think that you have early things like Jesus had a twin.
There is,
like
if I remember correctly, I'm not going to have to go back and read this again to remember where it was, but I seem to remember reading where after the crucifixion, when Jesus appears to them again, somewhere, it's not like the appearance, not the doubting Thomas appearance, but there's this, and maybe it's that, but the people who knew him didn't recognize him. His own mother didn't recognize him. He looked different.
Yeah,
that's actually part of like an ancient trope.
Is it in the Gospel of Luke where they don't recognize him?
I think so, but this is pretty common, certainly within the Hebrew Bible texts, and I believe you see it in Greek literature as well. One of the traits of deity is, the inability of people to recognize who they're talking to. And I think this is part of what Luke is feeding into in his retelling of this story. This is just another one of these earmarks which says, yeah, Jesus is a god because nobody recognizes him, right?
Yeah, so that's actually, now that I think about it, that's super common in especially Roman literature, like in the Aeneid.
Ovid.
It happens in the Hebrew Bible too.
Yeah, the Aeneid has that a whole bunch. Like, yeah, very common.
And for me, I've seen people faith believers will do ridiculous things to justify their belief. Like when they created the University of Transcendental Meditation in Des Moines, Iowa, under Rajneesh Bhagwan, I think it was. I can't write. No, Mahesh Yogi. It was under Mahesh Yogi.
Was it accredited?
I don't know. But I remember it was the Beatles, Maharishi that was behind this thing. But anyway, the point is that you had these guys that were learning how to fly. And what they would do is they get into a meditational position where they have their ankles and knees locked in lotus position, the one. And they're bouncing up and down on these pillows, bouncing on their hands with their knees locked in lotus position, flying.
Wow, I think I've seen. Something like that. This is
also a Tibetan Buddhist practice. They do the same kind of thing.
But they're not flying. They're bouncing around on pillows, pretending to be flying, right? And it's just like when George Harrison and John Lennon,
high though,
when they chant the mantras and then they see, Krishna. It's just like my friend the cat fancier when he sees Bast. It's like you will convince yourself to see shit that isn't there. So when you have these disciples and Jesus is dead, they see some guy and say that's Jesus.
Yeah,
that's what it sounds like to me.
Yeah, and that's
totally.
Yeah, that definitely could have happened. And there's like another very common thing is that it was a very traumatic experience. All of them were probably in severe trauma of having their leader just crucified and the entire movement collapsing out from under them. And when you're faced in a situation like that, one thing we know is even from just a spouse dying of old age is people have grieving experiences where they will witness a spouse come to visit them. a postmortem hallucination of some kind. My great grandmother had this when her husband Burton died in 1990. So it's something that's just it's a very common experience. It's what post bereavement communications are like. What in like 60 to upwards of 60% of cases, these can happen. And it is just a very plausible explanation here. The other thing we have to keep in mind is we don't have any authentic writings from any of Jesus's disciples. We don't know what they saw or even what if they claimed they saw anything. That's the big thing.
Yeah. And what we do have, and the reason why we've got it, is because while this Christian movement originated in Jerusalem, most likely, the Jewish war happened between 67 and 70. The city was by and large destroyed, and then some 50, 60 years after that, in 134, the Second Jewish War happened, and the Romans came back and made sure that the city of Jerusalem itself and the surrounding environs were pretty much unlivable. So while there was a church in Jerusalem, while the movement started there, it died there. The original form of whatever Christianity was is gone. The church that Paul talked about in the book of Galatians disappeared in this conflict, along with everything else in the city of Jerusalem. And what we're left with is Paul's version, right? This version that made its way around the Mediterranean and took on these various forms that were through which it was culturally appropriated into these other places. So it's in many respects it's fascinating and frustrating how much we can't access what happened in the first century in these early stages of the life of Jesus. We know almost nothing. In the early life of the church, we know almost nothing. But there are there are some echoes and some shadowy hints about some things that we can at least posit as likely in terms of who these people were and where they came from.
And I
If
think
I
even
may,
on top of that, there's even though the Gospels and the Johannine epistles, they're later than Paul, I still think they would be able to tell us about the communities and what they believed, right? Because when you're reading the Gospels, as a historian, you're not like learning about Jesus. You're learning about what the people believed about Jesus. So
Exactly.
when you are reading that stuff, like you might be able to discern some of what Jesus believed or taught. It does get kind of speculative, but like there might be like something in there that's preserved. But again, that's something that we have to handle it very carefully.
there's one last point that if we're talking about the historicity of Jesus and how Jesus has these parallels with prior gods, that I have to read the oft quoted Justin Martyr bit, not the larger quote, just the first paragraph thereof. And when we say also that the Word, who was the firstborn of God, was produced without sexual union, and that he, Jesus Christ, our teacher, was crucified and died and rose again and descended into heaven, we propound nothing different from what you believe regarding those whom you esteem the sons of Jupiter.
Yeah, and that's
Man, he's not wrong.
Yeah, that and that kind of thing was very common. Robert J. Miller, I believe he just recently passed away. or no, Richard J. Miller, my bad. He was part of the Jesus Seminar. He wrote a book on different like Greco-Roman birth narratives and their comparisons to Jesus. Dr. M. David Litwa also wrote. He wrote a book called "How the Gospels Became History," and has a section on there as well. And you find all sorts of really interesting things. So, for example, some Platonists believe that Plato was born from divine union, but it was non-sexual. Because Platonists did not believe that the gods engaged in sexual activity. So Plato was a demigod, basically, born of a virgin, sexless conception.
Yeah, the thing is, that happened in like a lot of Gnostic texts as well. Like on the origins of the world, there is this scene where Sophia is impregnated, but the sex scene it starts off super steamy, and you're like, oh, are we gonna get a super sexy scene? No, you don't. Instead, someone stares into her eyes, and she is impregnated. It's so boring.
Yep. Or you get
like that, but then
That's no fun. It didn't even involve her sitting on a toilet seat.
It didn't. Yep. No, that was reserved for the alphabet of Ben Sira, where that explained his birth. That which is a hilarious work. But the idea of like, oh, we believe the same things you believe kind of thing. Even Tertullian, he notes that he's like, hey, what we believe about the word and its relationship to God, it's exactly what Zeno and the Stoics believe. I mean, I think that Stoicism directly influenced Paul's theology, but that's a different story. But either way, like these are very common. These are very common rhetorical tools, very common methods of storytelling, especially in the world. Yeah.
Yep, and you'll find it with just about any of the miracles of Jesus are going to parallel this. So, like when he died, and then you get the zombie apocalypse of the dead saints coming alive and walking with everyone. And that's only found in the Gospel of Matthew and nowhere else. There are parallels to that as well. So, for example, I believe it's in Aurelius Victor's work on he is talking about when they were going to deify Hadrian, and the Senate was debating about this, and the Senate hated Hadrian because he was kind of just an awful person, and he killed a bunch of them and exiled others and like executed half their families. He was a nasty individual, especially in the last years of his life. So they were debating on whether or not they were ever going to give him divine honors the way that they had done with basically every previous Caesar. Well, then a miraculous event happened where all of the dead members of their families came back alive and were greeting them, and they got to. And after they greeted all of their dead family members, they're like, "This is clearly a miracle of Hadrian and the sign that we should divinize him." All of this happens. It has some remarkable similarities there. It's a specific sign of the deity of a person that people come alive after they have died. You also get like apotheosis experiences like you do in the Gospels of seeing the risen figure around again. So like Romulus, after he is taken up into the heavens and he becomes the god Quirinius, he comes down and visit and on a road and visits Julius Proculus, and he then tells Julius to go and share that he has been divinized with everyone. So
one of the ways that people deal with this grief, I'm hearing, is that they get this visit from their relatives, and even if it's just somebody that looks like their relatives, or they have to come up with some excuse for why their whole cult just got wiped out when the leader was taken down, and so they'll say, well, the election was stolen and he's still president, he's just ruling from Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah. No, yeah, that like I actually do think that like the Trump failure in 2020 to be reelected is actually, and the reactions to that is probably actually a really interesting series of parallels for thinking about potentially how the Jesus movement, through just different series of cognitive biases, had to try and figure out how to continue their movement and how their beliefs weren't wrong in the aftermath of the fact that they were quite visibly wrong. In the same way that you get the millenarians, like the Seventh-day Adventists and people like that. Their belief that the world was imminently going to end in the mid 1840s was wrong. But they had to continue forward somehow. The belief that the world was going of Jehovah's Witnesses, that the world was going to end in the early 1900s, was wrong. But they are always a series of events or theological explanations that then come up to accommodate those facts and then to renegotiate them into a context of this is still coming in the future. This was just an earlier sign of what's coming, or this is a sign of, Trump's actually just ruling at Mar-a-Lago, and stuff like that. You come up
May
with
21st, 2011. Harold Camping said that the world was going to come to an end at 6 p.m. Eastern time, as the world was going to crack in half.
Mm-hmm.
And so people in his congregation that were killing their own children, to save them from Satan. One guy spent all of his life savings on billboards warning everybody that they better accept Jesus, all that sort of thing. And then 6:02 p.m. there's this wonderful photograph of the net guy, now broke in his senior years, looking at his watch in confusion while the crowd around him is laughing.
Wow.
And the thing I find most disturbing about that is that Harold Camping had on his day planner that got leaked, prior to that moment, prior to the end day, he was still scheduling advertising meetings and meetings with donors for the following week.
Yeah.
So he knew that shit wasn't going to happen. But people are killing themselves because of the prophecy he made. And then what's the bullshit excuse when it didn't happen? He said it did happen. It just happened spiritually.
Yeah. That's
Yep,
and
that's another one too. It's like you get what are they called, like post-millennialists or whatever they're called, who believe that like the world did end in 70 CE with the destruction of the temple, and that we've been living in the end times.
The world.
Yeah. I'm sitting here like, I'm honestly not entirely opposed to that. I've been seeing how things have been going the last 15 years. And, we're on the brink of a complete global collapse from global warming. So, you know what? Maybe they're not completely wrong, but...
Hey, we have gone an hour over what I thought would be the ideal period of time for this discussion, but it did go very, very well. And I'm very, very pleased that you guys came onto my channel to have this discussion. This was important. So I want to thank you all, and let you guys close up with whatever else. If there was any points that should have been brought up, let's do that.
So I don't have much more to add than what's already been said. I'm sure there will be plenty of comments disagreeing with some of this stuff.
You think?
But yeah, shocker, right? But I hope that people in the comments will take what we said and at least consider it if they are currently mythicists. But as the least important person here, I would definitely like to go first and say, make sure to subscribe to Milwaukee Atheists.
Yeah, Chrissy.
Kipp wants to go first. That's
no. Okay, sorry.
Sorry, I don't think I have anything further to add, except thanks, Aaron. It's nice to it's nice to get to talk about some of the stuff, and both Lorence and Chrissy are super bright and fun to talk to. So
indeed.
So yeah,
pick a relevant topic. We'll do this again. I'd be happy to.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah.
All right.
For my last comments, I would just say, Firstly, the Gospel of Luke is definitely a pirate treasure map.
Okay, this guy. You want to piss me off so much. Fucking-
And then also I want to say, I think ultimately what it comes down to is also understanding that there was a historical Jesus is fun as it is a fun historical tidbit. I will ultimately say I don't think it's actually very relevant for understanding the origins of Christianity or for understanding the texts that we have. The texts we have don't care that about who Jesus was in a historical sense that we think of history today. They care about who Jesus was in their own theological context and socio-political context, which is a Jesus that fits their specific agendas and their literary traditions and their desired outcomes for a future world. And that is the Jesus that I think is ultimately the far more interesting and important one to understand and to actually look at, both for historical reasons and then also look at as the Jesus that is the most influential in the foundations of what we have as Christianity today. It was not the historical, probably failed apocalyptic prophet who was the foundation of Christianity. It was the people who reinvented him later and those reinventions that was.
Yeah, that guy failed. That guy lost, right?
Yeah.
Whatever he was doing didn't work.
Yeah, but that sounds like another topic.
Yeah, he's so much of a nobody, we don't know who he is. So whether or not that guy existed is ultimately a side issue that does not tell us much of anything about Christian origins. So where I stand on like the mythicist historicist debate is it's fun trivia. But beyond that, it doesn't actually get to it is a distraction for me from what is actual Christian origin studies.
Outstanding. Thank you very much.